The house on Black Hollow Ridge had stood for over 100 years, its bones creaking with secrets that no one in town dared speak aloud. After decades of abandonment, it was finally sold at an auction to a woman named Eleanor Marsh, a widow looking for a quiet place to restart her life after the sudden death of her husband. The locals whispered behind cupped hands that the house should have remained empty. But Eleanor, desperate for peace and unaware of the stories, moved in on the first rainy Tuesday of October. She arrived in an aging pickup truck with only a few belongings: an antique rocking chair, stacks of books, her late husband's record player, and an old oil painting of a foggy marsh. Her dog, Rufus, an old bloodhound with one cloudy eye, leapt down from the passenger seat and sniffed the damp earth nervously. The wind made the trees groan as Eleanor opened the heavy iron gate and stepped through, her boots crunching over the gravel driveway. The house loomed above her, 3 stories high, its pointed gables shadowing her like a scowl. Ivy strangled the brick walls, and several windows had long since lost their glass. Still, she whispered, "It's home," as though trying to convince herself. The first night was quiet, except for the occasional drip from the leaky faucet and the howling wind that slipped through cracks in the walls. She lit a fire in the parlor and curled up in her rocking chair, a thick wool blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Rufus lay by her feet, his ears twitching at every creak in the floorboards above. But it wasn't until nearly midnight that she heard the first knock. It was faint, muffled, 3 deliberate knocks from beneath the floor. Eleanor sat up. She tilted her head, listening. Rufus let out a low whine, his eyes fixed on the dark space between the floor and the bottom of the wall. Another knock came. 3 again. Then silence. She leaned forward, pushing back the rug and placing her ear to the floor. The wood was cold. Nothing. "Probably the pipes," she muttered, standing. But when she turned to walk away, a voice rose, barely a whisper, from the floorboards beneath her feet. It didn't say words exactly, but it was a breath, like something trying to form language from wind. That night, she barely slept. Rufus paced at the door, growling softly. The following morning, Eleanor explored the house room by room. It was larger than she'd thought. Dust covered most surfaces, but the layout was intact: 6 bedrooms, 2 parlors, a formal dining room, and a cellar that she hadn't yet dared to enter. While cleaning the second-floor study, she found a strange thing: a child's wooden shoe tucked behind a false panel in the bookcase. The shoe was tiny, hand-carved gap, and oddly pristine, as if time hadn't touched it at all. She set it on the mantel, brushing off the dust. That evening, as dusk swallowed the house and shadows climbed the walls, the knocking returned. This time it came from the west corner of the dining room. 3 slow knocks, then silence. Eleanor didn't investigate. She didn't move. But the next morning, she noticed the shoe had disappeared from the mantel. That afternoon, she drove into town to buy supplies. The cashier at the hardware store, a teenager with too much eyeliner and a piercing through his eyebrow, paused when she told him where she lived. "Black Hollow?" he asked. "The one near the ridge?" Eleanor nodded. "You should talk to Mrs. Calhoun," he said. "She's the local historian, lives above the bakery." "Why would I?" he shrugged. "You'll see." She didn't go to the bakery. She returned home just as the sun began to set. The air had turned colder. When she opened the front door, she found muddy footprints, small, barefoot prints, leading from the parlor to the stairs. Rufus was nowhere to be seen. She called for him, her voice echoing up the stairwell. A soft shuffle came from the second floor, then silence. She climbed slowly, her fingers trailing the dusty banister. The footprints continued up the stairs, vanishing into the gloom of the hallway. She found Rufus hours later, trembling in the corner of the master bedroom closet. His fur was damp, as though he'd been outside in the rain, but it hadn't rained since she'd arrived. That night, she locked her bedroom door and placed a chair against the knob. But it didn't stop the knocks. They came again, this time from beneath her bed. 3 knocks. Then breathing. Rufus refused to enter the room. By the end of the week, Eleanor had grown pale. Her eyes were ringed with sleeplessness, her voice brittle from silence. She couldn't explain what was happening. The shoe reappeared on the mantel, then vanished again. Her books rearranged themselves. Her record player spun when no one touched it, playing scratchy lullabies she didn't recognize. On the 7th night, the knocking changed. Instead of 3, there were now 5, faster, louder. from several places at once, and beneath it all, a voice, a child's voice, lisping, wet with hunger. "Let me out." Eleanor awoke to the sound of whispering. Not outside, not down the hall, but inside her bedroom. Her breath caught in her throat as she strained to listen. At first, it was only a soft rustle, like paper sliding across wood, then words, faint, giggling, unmistakably a child's voice repeating a rhyme she couldn't fully make out. She didn't dare move. Rufus lay curled near the foot of the bed, ears alert, eyes wide open. The whispers continued for nearly a full minute before they stopped as suddenly as they'd begun. Gathering what courage she could, Eleanor reached for the flashlight on her nightstand and flicked it on. The room was empty. The door still barricaded. The windows shut tight. She swung her legs off the bed, the floor cold beneath her feet, and crept toward the armoire, where the sound seemed to have come from. She flung the doors open. Nothing. But as she stepped back, the flashlight beam caught something faint, etched on the inside panel of the door. Tally marks. Dozens of them, carved deep into the wood. She ran her fingers over them. Some were old, the grooves worn soft with time. Others were fresh, splinters curling outward. She counted them, 78. She slept with the lights on that night, though slept was generous. The next day, she visited the bakery in town and asked for Mrs. Calhoun. A small bell above the door jingled as she entered. The smell of sugar and cinnamon drifted in the warm air, but Eleanor barely noticed. The woman behind the counter was elderly, thin as a broomstick, with a cloud of white hair pinned tightly to her head. "You must be the woman who bought the Ridge House," she said before Eleanor even introduced herself. "I need to know what happened there," Eleanor said. "Everyone in town avoids the place. They won't tell me why." Calhoun stared at her a moment, then nodded toward the narrow staircase behind the counter. "Come upstairs. Bring your dog." Eleanor and Rufus followed the woman into a cramped sitting room filled with dusty books, old maps, and sepia photographs in tarnished frames. Mrs. Calhoun poured tea with trembling hands. "I was a child when it happened," she began. "But I remember. My mother warned me never to go near that house, said it was cursed, said the ridge was a wound that never healed." She reached for a photograph on the table and passed it to Eleanor. The image showed the house, looking nearly the same as it did now, though its gardens had once been well kept. Standing in front were a man and a woman, stoic, unsmiling, and 5 children lined up like dolls. All pale, all staring. That was the LeClaire family. They lived there in the 1920s. The husband was a doctor. The wife was strange. People said she practiced folk rituals, blood magic, maybe even necromancy. The children disappeared one by one, each time it rained. Eleanor's grip tightened around the photograph. When the 3rd child went missing, they called in the police, but nothing was ever found. Then the 4th vanished. And finally, the youngest, a little girl named Lottie. She was just 5. Mrs. Calhoun's voice dropped to a whisper. After Lottie disappeared, her mother went mad, locked herself in the cellar and screamed for days. When they finally broke down the door, she was gone. No body, just claw marks on the walls and tally marks carved deep into the brick. Eleanor felt a chill snake down her spine. They sealed the cellar. No one's opened it since. That night, back at the house, Eleanor stood at the top of the basement stairs, flashlight in hand. The door groaned open, revealing narrow steps descending into shadow. Rufus refused to follow, barking once before retreating to the living room. She hesitated, then stepped down. The cellar smelled of rot and earth. Moisture clung to the stone walls. At the bottom, her flashlight flickered, catching glimpses of shelves, old jars, and crumbling furniture. But at the far end of the room, partially hidden behind a rusted boiler, was a bricked-up wall. She approached, heart pounding. The mortar was old, some of the bricks loose. One had already been removed. A gap yawned in the wall, dark and deep. Inside, the air pulsed, like breath. And then from the gap, a small hand reached out. Eleanor stumbled backward, flashlight clattering to the floor. The hand was pale, impossibly thin, and covered in dirt. Its fingers flexed slowly, scraping at the edges of the bricks. Then the whispering began again, closer this time. "Let me out." Eleanor fled. She spent the next day boarding up every door and window. She didn't eat, didn't sleep. She thought of leaving, of running far from Black Hollow Ridge, but something had changed. The house had its hooks in her. And deep inside, a voice, her own voice, kept whispering. You need to know what happened. You need to see it through. That evening, as the first drops of rain began to fall, Eleanor lit every candle she could find and sat in the parlor with the oil painting of the marsh resting against the wall beside her. She stared into its foggy depths, hoping for peace. But the whispers had changed. They no longer asked to be let out. Now they said her name. The sound was unmistakable now. Eleanor, spoken in a dozen voices, some whispering, others singing, one or two giggling like children at play. The room, once dim and warm with candlelight, suddenly felt hollow and cold, as though the walls had widened and the shadows had grown teeth. Rufus growled low, ears flattened. He backed toward the hallway, hackles bristling. Eleanor stood slowly, her skin tingling with dread. The painting beside her had changed again. The fog had cleared ever so slightly, revealing more of the decaying cabin by the marsh, and now, in its single broken window, there was a face. Pale, wide-eyed, watching. She didn't remember it being there before. Something compelled her forward. Not fear, something stranger. Like she was being drawn into a rhythm that had started long before she ever came to this place. Her feet carried her through the house, down the hall, past the old grandfather clock that ticked and tocked with increasing urgency. She stopped at the nursery. It was the only room she'd never opened. The key was on the mantel, hung on a rusty nail behind an old oil lamp. She'd noticed it her first day, but never thought much of it until now. The whispering grew louder as she approached, the syllables layering over each other in a discordant chant. Lottie! 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 Eleanor. Her fingers trembled as she fitted the key into the lock. The door creaked open. The nursery was untouched by time. Toys from another century sat neatly arranged on dusty shelves, wooden blocks, a rag doll, a tiny porcelain tea set. A mobile of moons and stars hung over a child-sized bed, swaying gently, though there was no wind. But it wasn't the room itself that made her stomach drop. It was the mirror. An old, full-length mirror stood in the corner, framed in ironwood. The glass was clean, not a speck of dust or grime. And in its reflection, though she stood alone in the room, there were children, 5 of them. They stood behind her, watching with hollow eyes, unmoving. Dressed in tattered old clothes, faces pale and lips blue. Eleanor turned with a gasp, but the room was empty. She looked back at the mirror. The children were closer now. One girl at the front reached out a small, translucent hand and touched the inside of the mirror, leaving a faint smear like fog on glass. Eleanor backed away, heart hammering. The whispering rose to a crescendo. The dolls in the room began to shake. The mobile spun faster and faster. And then, crack! The mirror split, a jagged fracture running from corner to corner like a lightning bolt. All fell silent. The children were gone. Eleanor fled the room and locked the door behind her. That night, the dreams returned, more vivid than ever. She saw the house as it had once been, full of life and warmth. The LeClaire children playing in the marsh, laughing. Their mother watching from the porch, a dark pendant swinging around her neck. Then came the rain, and with it, something ancient, rising from the black water. It had no face, only a smooth, bone-pale surface and a mouth that opened in endless hunger. One by one, the children vanished into the mist, their laughter swallowed by silence. And the mother, she did not cry. She knelt at the marsh's edge and whispered to the darkness, offering blood and breath in exchange for time. Eleanor woke screaming. She knew what she had to do. She returned to the cellar just before dawn, this time carrying her grandfather's old hammer and chisel. Rufus stayed behind, whining. The air grew colder with each step, as though the house was holding its breath. At the bricked-up wall, she began to work, one brick at a time. The whispering returned, but she ignored it. Her hands bled. Her arms ached. But she kept going. When the final brick fell, revealing the hidden chamber beyond, she stood in stunned silence. Inside was a small room, no larger than a closet. Its walls were covered in drawings, childlike scrawls of figures by the marsh, of a woman holding a dark pendant, of a great white mouth in the reeds. And in the center of the room sat a child, or what was left of one. The body was mummified, preserved by some unnatural means. Her dress was blue, her hair long and brittle. In her tiny hands, she held a torn scrap of fabric, the same pattern as the ones in the old photographs. Lottie. Eleanor knelt beside her. Her hands trembled. She didn't know what she was supposed to do. Bury her? Burn the house? Call the police? Then the whispering stopped. For the first time in weeks, silence. She turned and saw the other children, ghostly, translucent, standing at the threshold. They looked not at her, but at Lottie. One by one, they stepped into the chamber, surrounding their sister. And then they faded. Not violently, not in fear, like breath on glass. Eleanor sat there for a long time. When she finally emerged from the cellar, the sun had risen. The fog was gone. The marsh, for the first time, seemed still. She packed her bags that afternoon. By evening, the house was empty, but not abandoned, not cursed. At peace. Eleanor didn't look back as she drove away. The road out of Black Hollow twisted between gnarled trees and old fences, now bathed in golden sunlight. The forest, once ominous and looming, felt quiet, resting. She passed the rusted sign she had seen her first day, half swallowed by vines. Black Hollow, Est 1812. The letters no longer seemed like a warning, but a reminder. A place with history. A place with pain. A place she had, in some strange and terrible way, helped lay to rest. She drove straight through the next town without stopping. It wasn't until she reached the outskirts of Charlotte that she finally pulled into a roadside diner, parked her car, and breathed, really breathed, for the first time in weeks. Inside, she ordered coffee. Black. No sugar. Her hands still trembled as she wrapped them around the mug. A young waitress, no older than 20, approached and gave her a curious look. Rough morning? Eleanor forced a smile. You could say that. She sat for an hour, maybe longer, staring out the window at the humming highway and wondering how much of it had been real, how much had been her mind unraveling in the isolation of that place. But then she remembered the mirror. The cellar. Lottie. No. It had been real. She didn't tell anyone. Not the waitress. Not the police. Not even her therapist when she started sessions again 3 months later. Some things, she decided, were not meant to be explained. They were meant to be understood, quietly and privately. The nightmares faded with time, like bruises healing beneath the skin. But sometimes, late at night, she'd wake to the distant sound of children laughing, and she'd lie there, heart racing, until the silence returned. A year passed. Eleanor moved back to Chicago, took up photography again, sold 2 pieces to an art gallery downtown. One in particular drew attention. A stark black and white print of a foggy marsh, a broken wooden swing, and a lone child's shoe on the ground. She had taken it her last morning in Black Hollow. It became the gallery's bestseller. She named the photo Lottie. And then, one day in early spring, she received a letter. It was postmarked from North Carolina. No return address. Inside was a single sheet of yellowing paper, the kind that crackles when touched. On it was a child's drawing, simple, shaky lines. 5 stick figures, holding hands. One of them had a camera around her neck. Eleanor stared at it for a long time. Then she placed the drawing in a frame and hung it above her writing desk. Life moved on. But Black Hollow never really left her. It lingered in the edges of dreams, in the shadow of fog rolling off Lake Michigan, in the creak of her old wooden floorboards on rainy nights. And sometimes, when she walked past a playground or a schoolyard and heard children laughing in that wild, unrestrained way, she'd smile, because she knew. Somewhere in the reeds beyond the marsh, 5 children had finally gone home. Several years passed. Eleanor grew older, quieter. The events in Black Hollow had become less like scars and more like echoes, soft and strange, surfacing only in still moments. She never returned to the house, never wanted to. But the memory of it lived with her, tucked into the quiet corners of her life, like a ghost content to simply exist. One autumn evening, while she was sorting through an old storage box of negatives and prints, she stumbled upon something she didn't remember taking. It was a photograph, grainy, underexposed, of a room bathed in faint green light. A mirror stood at the center, cracked down the middle, and in its reflection stood 5 small figures. She stared at the photo for over an hour. She didn't remember ever taking it, didn't remember seeing that mirror after the night in the cellar, yet here it was. She framed it and locked it away. That night, she dreamed of water. Still, dark water stretching in all directions. She stood at its center, barefoot, surrounded by cattails swaying in wind she couldn't feel. From the marsh rose the children, Lottie, Henry, Alice, Bernard, and May. They looked older somehow. Not aged, just peaceful, content. Lottie stepped forward and spoke without moving her lips. "Thank you." And then they were gone. Eleanor woke in tears, but not from fear. She felt whole in a way she hadn't in years. The next morning, she took a walk through the park near her apartment, where the leaves had begun to turn and fall like paper from the trees. She watched a group of children playing tag. One of them, a little girl with wild dark curls, looked directly at her and waved. Eleanor smiled and waved back. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel haunted. She felt free. From that day forward, she continued her photography, focusing now on portraits of people, capturing light, joy, motion. Her work was celebrated across cities. Critics noted an otherworldly stillness in her photos, a kind of knowing, as if the subject and the artist shared a secret they weren't telling. They weren't wrong. Eleanor never spoke of Black Hollow again. But when she passed away, decades later, in a small sunlit home overlooking Lake Superior, her niece found a collection of journals tucked neatly in a wooden chest. They chronicled the story of the house, the mirror, the laughter in the marsh. And one final entry dated just days before Eleanor's death, written in a steady hand. Sometimes I hear them again just beyond the reeds. I am not afraid. The hollow is at peace. So am I. The niece read the story from beginning to end, crying silently the whole way through. She turned it into a novel. It became a bestseller. They named it The Hollow Children, and on the dedication page it simply read, "For Lottie, for Eleanor, for anyone who's ever faced the dark and come back with light."